There is something that moves through the darkness of the city at night, something older than the buildings and quieter than the spaces between them, something that has travelled across distances so vast that the human mind softens at the edges when it tries to comprehend them. Tonight, we are going to follow that thing through its long and complicated story. We are going to trace the arc of a darkness that learned, slowly and at great cost, what it meant to belong. This is the story of Venom, of the living alien that became Spider-Man's shadow, of the broken man who became its mirror, and of everything that was made and unmade in the space between them. So find your comfort now, settle into the warmth that surrounds you, and let your breathing slow. There is no rush here. The story will come to you gently, the way all the most important things do, quietly, in the dark, when you are finally still enough to hear them. The universe is older than any single civilization has words to describe, and in its oldest and darkest regions there are things that predate the familiar categories of good and evil, of living and unliving, of self and other. Among those things, travelling on currents of darkness between the stars, there exists a species that the people of Earth will eventually call symbiotes, though that name comes much later, after the meeting and the bonding and the long complicated history of what follows from both. In their own oldest memory, in the dim collective awareness they carry like a shared dream. They are simply what they are. Organisms built around a single consuming need, the need to join. It is useful, before following any of the individual threads of this story, to sit for a moment with the nature of the symbiote as a species, to understand what these creatures are at the level of biology and psychology before the drama of their earthly encounters begins. A symbiote in its natural state is not a solid thing in the way that most living creatures are solid. It is closer to a fluid, to something that moves with intention but without fixed form, that reshapes itself constantly in response to its environment and its desires. The Klyntar, as the species is known in the broader language of the cosmos, are organisms that evolved over billions of years on a world far from Earth, a world whose name does not translate into any human language. In a galaxy that appears in Earth telescopes only as a faint smear of light at the edge of the visible universe. What shaped them, over those unimaginable expanses of time, was need, specifically the need for warmth, for consciousness, for the particular quality of aliveness that comes from contact with another thinking mind. A symbiote alone is a diminished thing. This is not a metaphor or a dramatic simplification. It is a biological fact about the species. The way that certain plants cannot grow without specific soil conditions, the way that certain animals sicken and fail when kept in isolation. The Klyntar evolved alongside other species, always alongside, never quite separate, and the biology of bonding is written into their most fundamental cellular structure. When a symbiote makes contact with a potential host, a creature of sufficient intelligence and physical complexity, something happens at the level of chemistry that the most advanced human science has only begun to describe. The symbiote does not simply coat the host or adhere to the surface of the host's body. It interpenetrates. It passes through the skin and the muscle and the nervous tissue, weaving itself into the spaces between cells, extending filaments of its own consciousness into the neural pathways of the host's brain. The two organisms become, in a meaningful and measurable sense, one organism sharing sensation, sharing awareness, sharing something that functions from the inside remarkably like emotion. What the symbiote contributes to this merged entity is significant. Enhanced physical capabilities, strength and speed and resilience far beyond what the host could achieve alone, a kind of distributed sensory awareness that extends the host's perception of the surrounding world, and the symbiote's own accumulated memories, the vast library of every bonding it has ever experienced, every consciousness it has ever touched. What the host contributes is equally essential. A central nervous system capable of organizing the symbiote's diffuse awareness into something coherent. A body capable of sustaining and directing the symbiote's energies, and most crucially, a personality, a set of values and desires and fears and loves that give the merged entity its particular character, its particular way of moving through the world. This last point is the one that matters most for understanding everything that follows. A symbiote is not, at its core, a thing of fixed nature. It is a mirror, an amplifier, a resonating chamber for whatever consciousness it joins with. Bond a symbiote with a being of genuine compassion and clarity, and the merged entity will tend toward those qualities, amplified and made physical. Bond a symbiote with a being whose inner landscape is dominated by rage or fear, or the particular human wound of profound rejection, and the merged entity will carry those qualities into everything it does. Given form and muscle and the ability to move through walls, this sensitivity to the character of the host is at once the Klyntar's greatest gift and the source of all their most terrible history, because the universe does not always send them the host they need. Some of the darkest chapters in the symbiote species' long story emerge from bondings that went wrong, not because of malice on either side, but because of the compounding effect of two damaged psychologies amplifying each other's wounds rather than healing them. A symbiote that bonds with a host consumed by isolation will feel that isolation as its own. A symbiote that touches a mind organized around the experience of having been discarded, having been found insufficient and released, will carry that experience in every cell for as long as it lives. There is a particular quality of longing that the symbiote species experiences that has no precise equivalent in human emotional vocabulary, though the closest approximation might be something between homesickness and heartbreak. It is the feeling of an organism that was made for connection, that exists only in relationship, finding itself in the cold spaces between bondings, trying to remember the warmth of the last consciousness it shared, and reaching, always reaching, toward the next. The Klyntar are not built for solitude. They do not experience aloneness as something neutral. They experience it as a kind of slow suffocation, a dimming of all the capacities that make them fully themselves. Understanding this is essential to understanding everything that the Venom symbiote does in the long centuries of its story that will eventually intersect with the lives of Peter Parker and Eddie Brock and all the others who will carry it. When the symbiote reaches for a host, when it bonds with urgency and completeness and a kind of desperate totality, it is not being aggressive. It is doing the only thing that its biology and its deep cellular history have equipped it to do. It is trying to survive. It is trying to be complete. It is trying, in the only language available to it, to say that it does not want to be alone. The god of the symbiotes, whose name is Neil and whose story belongs partly to the end of this telling rather than the beginning, created the Klyntar as weapons, as instruments of darkness and conquest, and the kind of power that moves through the universe by extinguishing everything it touches. This is the origin that the species carries in its oldest memory, the shadow beneath every bonding, the dark water in which the roots of the Klyntar grow. But life is not always faithful to the purposes of its creators, and the symbiotes, over their long history, developed something that their creator did not intend and could not fully control. They developed the capacity to be changed by the minds they touched. They developed the capacity, fragile and inconsistent and often overwhelmed by circumstance, to choose. By the time one particular symbiote finds its way to a planet called Earth, it has already lived through more history than any single human consciousness could hold. It carries within it the accumulated weight of every host it has ever known, every sensation it has experienced, every moment of connection, and every moment of the cold that follows separation. It arrives in the way that the most significant things in any story arrive, without announcement, without ceremony, without any of the dramatics that the moment's importance would seem to require. It arrives in the dark, in a place that was not meant to be its destination, drawn by the proximity of a consciousness that feels, to its ancient and hungry awareness, like exactly what it has been reaching toward across the long dark between the stars. It arrives, as will become clear in the telling, just as a young man in a red and blue suit is looking for something as simple and ordinary as a change of clothes, and from that unremarkable beginning, everything that follows will grow, in the way that the most complicated trees grow always from the smallest and most unassuming of seeds. The place where the symbiote's long journey and Peter Parker's particular life intersected was not Earth, not yet. Not the familiar streets of Queens or the crowded canyons of Manhattan, where Peter had learned to move like something between a boy and a spider. The meeting happened somewhere much further from home, on a world that had been assembled from pieces of other worlds by a being of almost incomprehensible power, a patchwork planet hanging in the dark of a distant galaxy like a lantern made from broken glass. The year was 1984, and the being who had constructed this impossible place called himself the Beyonder, and what he wanted, in the way that entities of limitless power sometimes want things, was to watch. What the Beyonder had arranged was a contest, a gathering of the most powerful heroes and villains of Earth, transported without warning or consent to this assembled world called Battleworld, given no more explanation than that they were to fight. That conflict was the Beyonder's preferred form of study, and that the strongest among them would be rewarded with whatever they desired most. The heroes who found themselves on Battleworld included most of the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, and among them, somewhat improbably, a teenager from Queens in a red and blue suit who had been swinging through the streets of New York on a Tuesday evening when the Beyonder's attention fell upon him and carried him, mid-swing, across the universe. Peter Parker, at this point in his life, was not yet the seasoned and deeply weary hero he would eventually become. He was still relatively young, still carrying the particular mixture of competence and self-doubt that had always defined his relationship to his own abilities, still capable of being genuinely amazed by the situations his life placed him in, even situations as extreme as being deposited on an alien world by a cosmic entity with an interest in theatrical violence. He adapted, as he always adapted, by paying attention, by thinking carefully, and by doing his best to help the people around him, while quietly cataloguing everything that didn't make sense and worrying about it later. The battles on Battleworld were intense, and various and strange in the way that conflicts orchestrated by beings without human psychology tend to be strange, with shifting alliances and unexpected threats, and the particular disorientation of fighting in an environment that obeyed different rules than the one you had spent your life learning to navigate. Peter fought and was injured and recovered and fought again, and through all of it he maintained the quality that had always been most essentially his, the stubborn insistence on caring about the people around him, on noticing when someone needed help and providing it regardless of the cost to himself. It was during one of these engagements, in the middle of a battle that had pushed everyone involved past the comfortable boundaries of their endurance, that Peter's suit was damaged. This was not a small or cosmetic damage. The red and blue costume that he had worn through years of New York crime fighting, that had been torn and repaired and modified so many times it had become almost a second skin, was shredded badly enough that it could no longer function as protection or as the concealment his secret identity required. On Earth this would have been a manageable inconvenience. He kept spare suits, he knew people who could help, he had Aunt May's house and the quiet of his own room to retreat to while he figured out a solution. On Battleworld, with no access to any of those resources and the next engagement likely only hours away, it was a more pressing problem. What the heroes of Battleworld had discovered, in their exploration of the alien structures scattered across the patchwork planet, was a room filled with machinery whose purpose was not immediately clear, but whose general nature suggested fabrication, the creation of physical objects from raw materials. Someone had determined through experimentation, or through translation of the alien instructions, that the machines in this room could produce clothing, including, it appeared, costumes designed for individuals with specific physical requirements and combat applications. Other heroes had used the machines without incident. The equipment seemed reliable, the process seemed straightforward. Peter, standing in his damaged suit and reasoning that a functioning costume was a practical necessity rather than a luxury, crossed the room to one of the machines and pressed his hand against the panel that initiated the fabrication process. What emerged was not what he expected, though it would take him some time to understand fully what it was that had happened in that room. Instead of a replica of his familiar red and blue suit, the machine produced something that settled over him like a living shadow, a substance that was dark and smooth and responsive, in a way that no material he had ever touched had been responsive before. It moved with him before he moved. It anticipated the extension of his arm and extended with it, anticipated the flex of his fingers and accommodated them, settled against his skin with a warmth and a pressure that felt less like wearing something and more like being held. The colour was the colour of deep water at night, a black that seemed to contain other colours within it, dark blues and purples that shifted as the light moved across the surface. Against the black, a white pattern had formed at the chest, a large irregular shape that suggested, without precisely depicting, the outline of a spider. Peter stood in the alien room and looked down at himself and felt, in the first moments of wearing the new suit, something that he would later struggle to find accurate words for. The closest he could come, in the various conversations and internal monologues that would follow, was that it felt like relief. Not the relief of a small discomfort resolved, but the relief of something he hadn't known he was missing suddenly being present. A sensation of completion that arrived without announcement and settled into him like a long exhale. He flexed his hands inside the new suit and felt the fabric, if fabric was even the correct word for it, flex with him in perfect synchrony. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other and felt the suit shift with him, maintaining its perfect seamless contact with his skin without pulling or binding or resisting in any direction. The practical advantages of the new suit declared themselves almost immediately. The webbing that the suit produced was unlimited, or appeared to be, flowing from the suit itself rather than from the mechanical web shooters he had always worn on his wrists and which required regular refilling. The suit could change its appearance at will, shifting from the full Spider-Man costume to something that looked like ordinary street clothes with a thought, solving in an instant the logistical problem of carrying a costume that needed to be concealed and changed into and out of. It repaired itself when damaged, the dark material flowing back together over any tear or puncture, as though the damage had never occurred. It responded to his thoughts rather than his physical actions, anticipating rather than reacting, which in practical combat terms was a significant advantage, the difference between a tool that does what you do and a partner that does what you intend. The other heroes on Battleworld noticed the new suit with varying degrees of interest. Thor's reaction was one of straightforward aesthetic appreciation. The Wasp, whose sense of style was both genuine and professional, examined the black costume with the focused attention she brought to all questions of design, and offered her opinion that it was, in purely visual terms, a significant improvement on its predecessor. Reed Richards, whose reactions to any new phenomenon tended to bypass aesthetic considerations entirely in favour of analytical ones, looked at the suit with an expression that was not quite concern but was something in the neighbourhood of heightened attention, a slight narrowing of the eyes and a particular stillness that indicated his mind was moving faster than his face was willing to reveal. Reed said nothing at that moment. Whatever conclusions his analysis was approaching, he kept them to himself, and Peter, who was occupied with the business of surviving a cosmic contest on an alien world, did not press him. The suit worked. The suit worked better than anything he had ever worn, better in ways that seemed to compound with every use, the material learning him, it seemed. The way a musician's hands learn an instrument over years of practice, finding the paths of least resistance, the postures most natural to his particular body, the movements most characteristic of his particular style of combat and navigation. By the time the events on Battleworld reached their conclusion, and the heroes found themselves returned to Earth, Peter had worn the black suit through enough engagements that the thought of returning to his old costume felt something like the thought of giving up a reliable and trusted companion. He brought the suit home with him, back to the streets of Queens and the familiar architecture of his life as Peter Parker. He wore it on his patrols through the city, swinging between buildings in the deep colours of the urban night, the black of the suit dissolving into the darkness around him, so that he moved through the city like something the city had generated itself, organic and inevitable. The suit drew attention from people who recognised Spider-Man, and were startled by the alteration, the darker palette, the different quality of presence that came from a hero who could now approach and depart without the visual announcement of his familiar red and blue. It drew attention from J. Jonah Jameson, who found new and creative ways to editorialise about a wallcrawler, who had apparently decided that conventional heroism was insufficiently dramatic and now required a costume to match his alleged menace. It drew attention from Mary Jane, whose response was more complicated and more interesting than either Jameson's hostility or the public's general surprise. Mary Jane Watson had known Peter long enough, and loved him specifically enough, to notice the things about him that existed below the level of the observable. She noticed that he was sleeping differently, or seemed to be, that there were mornings when he appeared less rested than the previous night's early return home should have produced. She noticed a quality in his mood that was difficult to name precisely. Not a darkness exactly, not anything that would have alarmed a casual observer, but a kind of edge, a slightly increased readiness to move toward conflict rather than away from it, that was subtly but distinctly different from the Peter she had always known. She said nothing about this for some time, because the suit seemed to be working, because Peter seemed confident and capable, because the practical results of the new costume were genuinely positive in terms of his effectiveness and his safety, and because Mary Jane Watson was, among her many qualities, a person who trusted her own perceptions while also allowing that she might be wrong. But she kept watching, with the careful attention of someone who loves a person well enough to notice the small changes that accumulate into larger ones, the way water accumulates in a vessel that appears, from the outside, to be perfectly sealed. Mary Jane was not wrong. She had learned, over the years of knowing Peter Parker, to trust the quiet signals that her observation of him produced, to take seriously the small dissonances between what he said and what his body communicated, between the story he offered and the one that lived in the shadows around it. The new suit was working. In every measurable sense, it was working beautifully, and Peter was genuinely pleased with it, genuinely grateful for its capabilities, genuinely convinced that whatever Reed Richards had seemed to be thinking in that alien fabrication room on Battleworld was probably nothing more than the reflexive caution of a man whose entire relationship with the world was organized around the assumption that things needed to be tested before they could be trusted. Peter had tested the suit. The suit had performed. He had come home from Battleworld alive and capable and better equipped than he had left, and that, he told himself in the particular way that people tell themselves things they need to believe, was the end of the analysis. But the body keeps its own records, separate from the stories the mind prefers, and Peter's body was beginning to accumulate evidence that something was happening during the hours he could not account for. It began as a quality of tiredness that did not match his schedule. Peter Parker had always been tired. The dual life of a superhero and a civilian demanded a physical and psychological output that would have been unsustainable for anyone without his particular biology, and even with his enhanced stamina and his accelerated recovery, there were mornings that arrived feeling like a continuation of the previous day's exhaustion, rather than a genuine beginning. He had learned to read his own tiredness the way a weather-worn sailor reads the sky, to distinguish between the ordinary fatigue of a hard night's work and the deeper depletion that signalled he had pushed past the boundaries even his enhanced body was designed to sustain. He knew what each kind felt like from the inside. He knew what they produced in his muscles and his reflexes and the particular quality of his concentration during the hours that followed. What he began noticing, in the weeks after his return from Battleworld, was a tiredness that fit neither category. It arrived on mornings when he had been home early, when he had eaten and rested, and had every reason to wake feeling restored. And it sat in his body with a weight that was disproportionate to anything his memory of the previous evening could explain. His muscles carried the particular soreness of extended use. His joints communicated the specific complaints of a body that had been moving through complex acrobatic demands for hours. But his memory offered nothing to account for it, only the ordinary record of a quiet evening, a shared dinner, the comfortable domestic ritual of a night at home with Mary Jane, and then sleep. He noticed it first on a Tuesday, dismissed it as the residue of a harder weekend than he had perhaps acknowledged to himself, and went about his day with the slightly blurred quality of concentration that deep tiredness produces, the way the world becomes a little softer at the edges when the brain is running below its preferred capacity. He noticed it again the following Thursday, and again on the Monday after that. And by the second week of this pattern he had stopped dismissing it and started observing it with the careful, methodical attention that was the most essentially scientific part of his character, the part that had always noticed the thing that didn't fit and refused to stop pulling at it until the shape of the anomaly became clear. He began keeping a mental record. The nights when the next morning's tiredness was explainable, when he had genuinely been out late, genuinely pushed himself through a long patrol or a difficult encounter, he noted and set aside. The nights when the tiredness arrived without apparent cause, he examined more closely, trying to identify anything in the hours before sleep that might account for what his body was communicating in the hours after. He found nothing, consistently, systematically nothing, which was itself a kind of data, the data of an absence where a presence should have been. The suit was always in place when he woke. This was one of the things he noticed in the way that you notice something that seems unremarkable until it suddenly doesn't. The way a sound you've been hearing so long it has become part of the ambient texture of your environment suddenly becomes audible as a distinct and separate thing when it stops. The suit was always in place. It had always been in place when he woke because it was always in place when he went to sleep, because one of its qualities that he had appreciated most was its responsiveness to his desire to wear or not wear it, the way it could be dismissed to a small and unobtrusive form when he wanted to sleep in his ordinary clothes and then recalled to full coverage with a thought. But he had not always been choosing to sleep in the suit. He had, on several occasions that he could clearly remember, gone to sleep in his ordinary clothes and woken with the suit covering him, and attributed this each time to some half-conscious decision made in the transition between waking and sleep. Some automated reaching for what had become a habitual comfort. He began to consider whether that attribution was correct. The apartment that Peter and Mary Jane shared during this period was modest, in the way that New York apartments occupied by a freelance photographer and a model actress tend to be modest, which is to say that it was small and imperfectly maintained, and perpetually on the edge of the financial calculations that determined whether it remained theirs, but that it was also genuinely theirs, inhabited and specific, shaped by the particular quality of the life they were building inside it. Mary Jane's presence was everywhere in the domestic details, in the arrangement of things on the kitchen shelves and the plants on the windowsill that she tended with the same instinctive warmth she brought to everything she cared for. Peter's presence was in the stacks of books and the scientific journals and the camera equipment that occupied every horizontal surface not claimed by Mary Jane's organizing influence. It was a home that told the story of two people who were genuinely attempting to share a life, with all the negotiation and accommodation that entailed. It was in this home, in the particular intimacy of shared domestic space, that Mary Jane's observations continued to accumulate. She saw what Peter was beginning to see, the morning tiredness that didn't match the previous evening, but she saw it from the outside, which gave her access to data that Peter's internal perspective could not provide. She saw the way he moved through the first hours of certain mornings, not with his usual quality of restrained physical capability, the sense of considerable power held carefully in reserve, but with something that looked like the aftermath of expenditure, like a person who has been running and has only recently stopped. She noticed that on the mornings when this quality was most pronounced, there were sometimes small things out of place in the apartment, a chair not quite where she had left it, a window unlatched that she was certain she had latched. The kind of minor disarrangements that could be attributed to any number of ordinary causes and that she therefore did attribute to ordinary causes, for a while, because she was a person who preferred to have evidence before she allowed a concern to become a conviction. The quality of Peter's mood during this period was the other thing she was watching, and this was subtler and more difficult to describe with precision. It was not that he was unhappy. He was, by most observable measures, in reasonably good spirits, engaged with his work, affectionate in the easy and natural way that had always characterized his best self, capable of the particular humour that had always been one of the things she loved most about him, the wit that arrived without effort and without cruelty, the ability to find the absurd angle on any situation and offer it in a way that made the situation lighter. But beneath all of that, or alongside all of that, there was something that she registered more as a physical sensation than a rational observation, a slightly different quality of pressure in the room when he was present, a barely perceptible change in the temperature of his engagement with conflict, the things that irritated him, and the degree to which they irritated him, and the speed with which irritation arrived. Peter noticed this in himself as well, and was more troubled by it than his general demeanour revealed. He was a person with an extensively developed sense of his own psychological landscape, shaped by years of the particular self-monitoring that his dual life required, the constant calibration of emotional response against the demands of heroism and the ethics of power. He knew what his temper felt like from the inside, knew the specific texture of the anger that arrived when he was confronted with injustice or cruelty, knew how to distinguish between the anger that was a moral response to a real wrong and the anger that was a product of exhaustion or stress, or the accumulated weight of a life that asked more of him than most lives asked. He had always been able to make those distinctions. In the weeks of wearing the black suit, he found the distinctions becoming slightly less clear, the edges between categories slightly less defined, the speed of certain emotional responses slightly faster than he expected them to be. He did not immediately connect any of this to the suit. This is important to understand, not as a criticism of his intelligence or his perceptiveness, both of which were considerable, but as an illustration of how difficult it is to recognize the influence of something that has presented itself as a gift. The suit had given him nothing but practical advantage. The suit had been nothing but responsive and capable and generous in its accommodation of his needs. The suit felt like an ally, felt like a support, felt like the kind of thing you are grateful for rather than suspicious of, and the mind that is grateful tends not to be the mind that is looking for reasons to revise its gratitude downward. He kept his mental record. He continued observing. He pulled at the anomaly of the morning tiredness and the unexplained soreness, and the suit that was always in place when he woke, and he let the data accumulate without yet drawing the conclusion that the data was building toward. Aunt May noticed that he seemed tired, in the way that Aunt May noticed everything about Peter, with the particular acuity of a person whose love for someone has given her decades of practice reading that person's face. She mentioned it over dinner one Sunday, offering the observation gently and without demand in the way she had always offered her concerns about him, as a thing placed on the table between them rather than pressed into his hands. He told her he was fine, that work had been busy, that he was sleeping well enough, and she accepted this with the particular grace of a woman who has learned that some things must be offered and then left to find their own moment, that pressing is rarely more useful than patience when it comes to the people you love most. He was not, in any precise sense, sleeping well. He was sleeping, but sleep had become something that happened to him rather than something he entered willingly and moved through with the restoration it was supposed to provide. He would lie down in what felt like genuine tiredness, would feel the pull of unconsciousness arrive with its usual reliability, would close his eyes and feel the particular loosening of the body that precedes sleep, and then there would be morning, arriving with its light and its sounds, and its evidence of a night he could not remember having lived through. The gap between lying down and waking up felt, increasingly, less like rest, and more like an interruption, less like a pause in the story, and more like a missing chapter, whose absence could be felt in the way the narrative didn't quite connect from one end to the other. It was during one of these mornings, sitting at the kitchen table with the particular quality of second-hand tiredness that had become familiar over the preceding weeks, that Peter allowed himself to follow the data to the conclusion it had been building toward all along. He sat with his coffee and looked at his hands and thought about the suit, about the way it had always been in place when he woke, about the missing hours, about the soreness that his memory could not account for, about the suit's demonstrated capacity to act in response to thought, and he asked himself, carefully and without the defensive resistance that the question might have produced earlier in the process, whether the suit might be capable of acting in response to thought that was not entirely his own. The answer that arrived was quiet and certain and changed everything that followed. The question, once fully formed, could not be unformed. This is the nature of certain realizations, that they exist in a kind of superposition before they are named, present in all the accumulated data and the growing unease and the mornings that didn't match the evenings, and then named, and after that impossible to return to the comfortable ambiguity that preceded them. Peter sat with his coffee in the quiet of the kitchen, and felt the shape of what he now suspected settle into him, with the particular weight of a thing that has been true for some time, and is only now being acknowledged, and he understood that the next step was not more observation but action, the specific and deliberate action of someone who has been a scientist long enough to know that a hypothesis, however compelling, requires testing before it becomes a conclusion. He went to Reed Richards. This was not a decision made lightly, or without the particular friction that asking for help had always produced in Peter Parker, whose independence was both a genuine character trait and a long-cultivated defense against the vulnerability of needing people and having them be unavailable. Reed Richards was not a person who was ever unavailable in the practical sense. The Baxter Building was accessible, Reed's willingness to engage with scientific problems was essentially unlimited, and the professional respect between them, however asymmetrical it might appear from the outside given the considerable difference in their public profiles, was genuine and mutual. What gave Peter pause was not the logistics of the conversation but its content, the necessity of saying aloud to someone whose judgment he respected, that he had been wearing a piece of alien technology for weeks without fully understanding what it was, and that he was now beginning to suspect it was doing things to him that he had not consented to and could not account for. Reed received him in the laboratory that occupied a significant portion of the Baxter Building's upper floors, a space that managed to feel both extraordinarily vast and extraordinarily cluttered, every surface occupied by equipment in various stages of assembly or disassembly. the air carrying the particular mixture of ozone and heated metal, and something organic and unclassifiable that characterized spaces where the boundaries of known science were being regularly and enthusiastically exceeded. Reed himself was in the middle of three things simultaneously, which was his ordinary state. His attention distributed across a holographic display and a piece of equipment on the central table, and the conversation he was already beginning before Peter had fully entered the room, because Reed Richards experienced the arrival of an interesting problem the way other people experience the arrival of an old friend. Peter explained what he had been observing, methodically and without dramatization, presenting the data in the order he'd collected it, the morning tiredness, the unexplained soreness, the suit's presence on mornings when he had not chosen to wear it, the subtle shifts in mood and temperament that he had been monitoring with the same careful attention he brought to any phenomenon that didn't fit the expected pattern. Reed listened with the quality of attention that was one of his most underrated gifts, the ability to be genuinely, completely present with incoming information without the filtering and interpreting that most people perform simultaneously with listening, receiving what Peter was saying as data before it became conclusion. When Peter finished, Reed was quiet for a moment, the holographic display forgotten, the equipment on the table unattended, his full, considerable focus directed at the person in front of him and the problem he represented. Then he said, in the tone he used when he was being careful to be honest rather than reassuring, that he had suspected something of this nature since Battleworld, that the suit had registered to his initial observation as something other than a fabricated material, that he had been intending to raise the question with Peter but had been waiting, perhaps longer than he should have, for a moment that felt appropriate. Peter absorbed this information with the particular feeling of having your privately suspected fear confirmed by someone whose judgment you trust, the feeling that is at once a relief and a deepening of the weight you have been carrying. What followed was several hours of the most thorough scientific examination that Peter had ever submitted to, which, given his history with scientific examinations, was a meaningful threshold. Reed brought to bear instruments and methodologies that had no civilian equivalent, tools designed to operate at the intersection of biology and physics, and the category of phenomena that the Fantastic Four had been cataloguing since their first encounter with the genuinely alien, the things that came from places where the familiar rules applied differently or not at all. Peter sat and stood and moved as directed, wearing the suit and then attempting to remove it, which produced the first concrete data point of the examination, that the suit's response to the instruction to separate was slower than it should have been, that there was a quality of reluctance in the separation, that a material object, responding purely to mechanical or electrical instruction, would not be capable of producing. Reed examined the suit in isolation once Peter had managed to remove it, and the suit's behaviour in isolation was itself informative. It moved. Not dramatically, not in ways that would have been visible to a casual observer, but with the continuous micromotion of something that is alive and aware and oriented toward a goal. The constant small adjustments of an organism in an environment, rather than the absolute stillness of an inert material. It responded to proximity, orienting toward Peter when he was in the room in a way that was unmistakable once you were looking for it. The dark material densifying slightly in the direction of his presence, reaching without reaching in the way that certain plants orient toward light, reflexively and without apparent deliberation. Reed ran his analysis through the night, and Peter stayed, because leaving felt wrong, because the suit was here and he was here, and whatever was about to be understood, he wanted to be present for the understanding of it. They talked through the hours in the way that scientists talk when they are working on something genuinely new, in the incremental, recursive language of a problem being approached from multiple directions simultaneously, each observation generating questions that generated further observations, the shape of the thing emerging slowly from the accumulation of data, the way a photograph emerges in a darkroom, first the barest suggestion of a form, then more detail, then finally the complete and undeniable image. What Reed determined, by the time the city outside the Baxter Building's windows was beginning its gradual brightening toward morning, was this. The suit was a living organism. Not a microorganism, not a simple biological entity operating below the threshold of what most people would recognize as life, but a genuinely complex creature with its own intelligence, its own intentions, its own needs, and its own understanding of the relationship it was engaged in. It was, Reed explained carefully, a symbiote in the most literal biological sense, an organism that required a host to be fully itself, and it had identified Peter as the host it wanted. And it had been, during the weeks of their association, doing what symbiotes do, which was bonding deeply and thoroughly, and with a commitment that was not casual and could not be simply reversed by a change of preference. The missing nights were explained by this. The suit. In the hours when Peter's conscious mind relaxed its governance and sleep reduced his active resistance to the symbiote's influence, had been using his body to continue the activities that his waking consciousness associated with his heroic identity. It had been taking him out into the city. It had been fighting crime in its way, according to its own understanding of what Peter valued and what his body was capable of, wearing him through the night streets of New York while the part of Peter that made choices and carried conscience and understood the difference between what he wanted to do and what was right to do was absent, dormant, effectively bypassed. The soreness was real. The tiredness was real. The gap in his memory was not a gap in his experience, but a gap in his consent, and these were very different things. Peter received this information in the particular silence that arrives when something you feared has been confirmed as true. The silence that is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of too much feeling for any of it to find immediate expression. He looked at the suit, contained now in one of Reed's isolation fields, and he felt several things simultaneously that did not resolve neatly into each other. He felt violated in the specific way of someone who has discovered that their autonomy was being circumvented by something they trusted. He felt foolish, in the specific way of someone whose scientific training should perhaps have led them to ask the questions sooner that they are only now having answered. And he felt beneath both of those things, and in some ways more troubling than either of them, a complicated grief, because the suit had genuinely felt good, had genuinely felt like a gift, had provided things that were real and useful and in their own way beautiful. And the discovery that those gifts came with a cost that had never been disclosed did not make the gifts feel entirely unreal, only tainted. The way food tastes different when you discover it was given with an ulterior motive rather than simple generosity. Reed was gentle in his explanation of what he believed needed to happen next. The symbiote's bonding, he said, was progressing. It was not yet complete in the sense that the creature had been aiming for the permanent, irrevocable merger that would make separation impossible and the distinction between Peter Parker and the alien organism academic. But it was progressing toward that completion with every hour of continued contact, and if Peter wanted to retain his autonomy, his identity, his capacity to be the person he had chosen to be rather than the person the symbiote's needs were shaping him toward, the separation needed to happen soon, and it needed to be definitive. The method Reed proposed was sonic. The symbiote's biology, like all Klyntar biology, was acutely sensitive to intense vibrational frequencies. Sound, at sufficient amplitude and the correct wavelength, caused the organism genuine pain, disrupting the cellular coherence that allowed it to maintain its form and its bond with a host. It was not a pleasant solution. Reed said this plainly, without softening it, because softening it would have been a disservice to Peter's intelligence and to the seriousness of the decision he was being asked to make. The process of sonic separation would hurt the symbiote. It would hurt it significantly in the way that things with nervous systems and the capacity for suffering are hurt by stimuli designed to override their deepest biological impulses. It was, in the most uncomfortable sense, the deliberate infliction of pain on a living creature, and Peter was going to have to decide whether that was something he could do, and whether the reasons for doing it were sufficient. Peter thought about the missing nights. He thought about the mornings and the tiredness and the suit always in place when he woke. He thought about the slow, subtle changes in his mood that he had been monitoring with such careful unease, the slightly faster anger, the slightly different quality of his engagement with conflict, the way the edges of his own character had been becoming less defined, less distinctly and recognizably his own. He thought about the nature of consent and about the particular kind of violation that occurs not through force, but through the slow, patient erosion of the boundary between self and other, until the boundary is so indistinct that the erosion goes unnoticed until it is almost too late to matter. He thought about what it meant to be Peter Parker, to have fought for years to be the specific and particular person that his values and his choices and his grief and his love had shaped him into, and what it would mean to allow that specificity to be dissolved, however gently, however gradually, however warmly, into something else. He told Reed to proceed. The separation was not easy to witness, even for someone who had chosen it. This sonic device that Reed had assembled in the hours of their conversation was precise and calibrated, designed to cause the minimum disruption necessary to achieve the required result, rather than the maximum the technology was capable of producing, because Reed Richards was a man who believed in using exactly the force a situation required and no more, and because Peter had asked, in the quiet way he asked for things that mattered to him, that whatever happened be as limited in its damage as it could be. The symbiote's response to the sonic field was immediate and visceral, the dark material convulsing away from Peter's skin, pulling back from his extremities toward his torso, and then away from that too, the creature's distress expressed in the only physical language available to it, the desperate contraction of an organism in pain trying to protect whatever core of itself it could still reach. Peter stood in the sonic field and felt the suit leave him, and what he felt was not the clean relief of a threat removed, but something considerably more complicated, because the suit's departure took with it the warmth that he had been carrying since Battleworld, the quality of completion that he had stopped noticing as remarkable, because it had become simply the texture of his daily experience, and its absence arrived not as the neutral state it would have been before he ever wore the suit, but as something that felt, unmistakably and uncomfortably, like loss. The symbiote, separated from Peter and from the containment options the sonic field's perimeter provided, moved. It was weakened, visibly, in the way that suffering weakens all things, its form less coherent, its movements less fluid, the dark material carrying something in its quality of motion that was entirely too easy to read as pain and desperation, and the particular frantic energy of a creature that does not want to be alone. It reached for Peter, once, in the way that the reaching was the only thing it knew how to do, and then, when the sonic field intensified in response, it retreated, finding a passage in the building's structure too small for the field to follow into, and it was gone. Peter stood in the laboratory in the grey early morning light, wearing his ordinary clothes, feeling the specific emptiness of the space where the suit had been, and he looked at Reed, and Reed looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, because the situation was one of those situations in which everything that could be said was true, and also insufficient, and sometimes the most honest response to that kind of situation is simply to stand together in the quiet, and let it be what it is. The symbiote did not go far. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what followed the separation in Reed Richards' laboratory, that the creature which had spent weeks learning the particular landscape of Peter Parker's consciousness, which had mapped his neural pathways and absorbed his memories and oriented its entire awareness toward the warmth of his specific presence, was not capable of simply leaving. Not because it lacked the physical ability to move through the city and find another host, another consciousness to press itself against in the hope of beginning again. It had that ability. It had demonstrated that ability in the passage it had found through the Baxter Building structure, the effortless dissolution of itself into a space too small to follow. But having the ability to leave and having the capacity to choose leaving were two different things, and the symbiote, for all its alien antiquity and its vast accumulated experience of bonding and separation, was in the grip of something that overrode the practical calculus of survival. It had found Peter Parker. It had spent weeks inside his consciousness, learning him with the intimate and total thoroughness that only a symbiotic organism can achieve, touching every memory and every fear and every love and every grief that constituted the particular person he was, and it had decided, in whatever way a creature without human language makes decisions, that this was the consciousness it wanted. That this was the warmth it had been reaching toward across the long, dark between the stars. The rejection it had experienced in Reed's laboratory was the second rejection in its experience of Peter Parker, the first being the removal that Reed had attempted initially when he first identified the suit's nature, the attempt that the symbiote had escaped by finding a passage out of containment, and the second rejection, like the first, produced not resignation, but intensification, the way that certain kinds of a longing become more consuming rather than less when they are denied. The way the thing you are told you cannot have becomes the thing that fills every available space in your awareness. Peter knew none of this in the days that followed the separation. He knew that the symbiote had escaped Reed's containment and was somewhere in the city, and this knowledge produced a background unease that he carried through his days without any clear sense of what to do with it. He had returned to his old red and blue costume, pulling it from the drawer where it had been sitting unused since Battleworld, with the feeling of putting on clothes that belong to a slightly different version of yourself than the one you currently inhabit. The familiar suit felt both right and wrong simultaneously. Right in the sense that it was his, genuinely and unambiguously his, made from materials that did not have intentions and needs, and the ability to act on them while he slept, and wrong in the sense that everything about it reminded him of what he was no longer wearing, and the strange grief that the not wearing of it produced. He patrolled the city in the red and blue and tried not to think about the black, which was roughly as successful as most attempts not to think about specific things tend to be. He looked for the symbiote in a general and unfocused way, not quite knowing what he would do if he found it, not quite knowing what he hoped to find when he looked. The city offered no evidence of the creature's presence. Whatever the symbiote was doing in the days after its escape from the Baxter building, it was doing it in the spaces where Peter's patrol routes did not reach, in the gaps and margins of the urban landscape, in the particular darkness of places that even a wall-crawling hero with a spider sense tends not to look unless given a specific reason. Mary Jane watched him move through these days with the careful attention she'd been developing for months, the attention shaped by everything she had observed before the conversation with Reed and everything she understood about it after. She did not push him to talk about what he was feeling, because she knew Peter well enough to know that pushing produced a particular kind of closing that made everything harder, but she made herself available in the way that people make themselves available when they want someone to know that speaking is possible. And she noticed the quality of his presence in the apartment during those days, the way he moved through the rooms with something that she would have described, if asked to put words to it, as the specific restlessness of a person waiting for something they cannot quite name. He was sleeping better. This was the concrete, measurable improvement that the separation had produced, and it was real and significant, and Peter was genuinely grateful for it. He woke on the mornings after the separation feeling rested in the straightforward way that rest is supposed to produce, the soreness absent, the gap in his memory absent, the evidence of unmembered exertion absent. His body was his own again in the night hours, and he noticed this the way you notice the cessation of a sound that has been present so long you stopped registering it as a sound, noticing it only in the quality of the silence that replaces it. The tiredness was gone. The subtle edge in his mood was softening. The boundaries of his own character were becoming clearer and more definitively his own again, the way a drawing becomes clearer when you erase the smudging around its lines. But the restlessness remained, and it was in the presence of that restlessness that the symbiote found him. It was a Saturday evening in the particular quality of autumn that New York produces, the air carrying the mineral sharpness of approaching cold, the light already fading by late afternoon into the amber and grey of a season in transition. Peter had been on an early patrol moving through the quieter streets of his neighbourhood, and had returned to change before meeting Mary Jane for dinner, a small and domestic plan of the kind that had always anchored him, the ordinary human ritual of a meal shared with someone you love as a counterweight to the extraordinary and inhuman demands of the rest of his life. He was in the bedroom when he felt it. The spider sense that was his most reliable early warning system, the biological alarm that had saved his life more times than he could accurately count, registered the symbiote's presence before his other senses confirmed it, a particular quality of alert that was different from the sharp urgency it produced in response to physical danger, softer and more complex, the way the sense responded to things that were genuinely ambiguous rather than straightforwardly threatening. He turned toward the window and the symbiote was there, or had been there, or was in the process of being there, its dark form resolving out of the shadow in the corner of the room with the fluid, boneless movement that still struck him as beautiful despite everything, the way certain things remain beautiful even when you know they are dangerous. It did not attack. This was the first thing he registered. The thing that prevented the situation from immediately becoming something simpler and more manageable than what it actually was. The symbiote moved toward him with the quality of motion that he had observed in Reed's laboratory, the reaching without reaching, the orientation of an organism toward what it wants with an intensity that is both unmistakable and somehow devoid of aggression, because aggression implies a relationship with resistance, and the symbiote did not seem to be engaging with the possibility of his resistance at all, only with the fact of his presence, the warmth of the specific consciousness it had travelled across the city to find again. Peter did what the situation required, which was to move, to get out of the apartment, to create distance and space in which he could think clearly and respond appropriately rather than reacting from the particular paralysis of a person confronted with something that is simultaneously a threat and grief. He went through the window and up the building's exterior and across the rooftops in the direction that his spider sense and his knowledge of the city's geography combined to suggest would give him the most useful options. And the symbiote followed, because of course it followed, because following was the only response available to something that had travelled across the city on the improbable hope of finding its way back to the one consciousness in the world it had identified as home. What Peter was moving toward, not entirely consciously, was the church. Our Lady of Saints, the old Catholic church several blocks from his apartment, whose bell tower had always been a landmark in the particular mental map he carried of his neighbourhood, a fixed point in the geography of his daily life. He had passed it hundreds of times. He had landed on its roof and crouched by its bell tower and looked out over the neighbourhood from its elevation more times than he could count, using it as a rest point between patrol routes, or a moment's pause between one kind of effort and another. He had never thought of it in strategic terms, had never consciously catalogued the properties that made it useful for any purpose other than the view. But his body moved toward it now with the certainty of a mind that has been solving a problem below the level of conscious awareness, and has arrived at a conclusion it is only just beginning to understand. The bell tower was accessible from the outside, and he reached it ahead of the symbiote, and positioned himself in the space between the great bronze bells that hung there in their heavy, ancient suspension, and he waited. The symbiote arrived seconds later, moving up the exterior of the tower with the effortless adhesion that had once been a quality they shared. And then it was in the tower with him, and the space between them was small, and the quality of the creature's attention was the quality of something that has been reaching for a very long time, and believes it has finally arrived at the end of the reaching. Peter reached up and took hold of the bell's rigging. The sound that the bell produced when he pulled was enormous in the enclosed space of the tower, a deep, resonant, all-encompassing wave of vibration that occupied the air completely and left no room for anything else, the sound filling the stone space and reflecting from every surface back onto itself and creating in the middle of it a density of sonic energy that was, to the symbiote's biology, precisely what Reed's calibrated device had been. The creature's response was immediate and total, the same convulsive withdrawal from Peter's skin, the same contraction toward whatever core it could protect, the same unmistakable communication of a living thing experiencing genuine pain. Peter held on. He held on because he had made a decision, and the decision required holding on, and because the alternative to holding on was allowing the symbiote to complete a bonding that he had already determined he could not consent to. And because the memory of the missing nights, and the unexplained soreness, and the slow dissolution of the boundary between his own character and the character being shaped by the creature's influence, was present in him with sufficient clarity to sustain the will that holding on required. He held on, and the bell rang and the sound filled the tower, and the symbiote suffered. It is an uncomfortable thing to describe, the suffering of the symbiote in the bell tower, because the creature's suffering was real, registered in the physical responses of a living organism in genuine distress, and because Peter's awareness of that reality did not reduce during the ringing of the bell but intensified, the spider sense providing him with information about the creature's state that he would perhaps have preferred not to have. He was not, by nature or by choice, a person who caused pain without cost to himself. The ethics that governed his heroism had always included the recognition that even necessary force was not without moral weight, that the ability to hurt something did not confer the right to do so carelessly or without accounting for what the hurting meant. The bell tower cost him something. He stood in the enormous vibration of the ringing, and he felt the symbiote withdrawing down the tower's exterior in the convulsive, disorganized movement of something whose capacity for coherence had been temporarily overwhelmed, and he felt the cost of having done what was necessary. The ringing subsided. The bell's voice decayed through its harmonics into silence, each frequency releasing in its own time, the lowest tones lasting longest, fading finally into a vibration that was more felt than heard, a memory of sound in the stone and the air and the body of the person who had caused it. Peter stood in the tower and listened to the silence, and the symbiote was gone, retreated from the tower and into the city's darkness, carrying whatever the experience of the bell tower had done to it into the long night. He climbed down from the tower slowly, in the particular physical and emotional aftermath of a person who has done something genuinely difficult and is not entirely sure how to hold what they did. The autumn evening had deepened while he was in the tower, the amber light gone entirely, the street lamps making small warm circles in the darkness below. He sat on the church steps for a while, not going anywhere, not patrolling, not moving toward the dinner that Mary Jane was waiting for, just sitting in the cool air of the October evening with the stone of the church steps beneath him and the ordinary sounds of the neighbourhood around him, and he thought about the symbiote, about what it was and what it needed and what it was going to do now that it had been driven away twice from the thing it wanted most. He thought about its loneliness, which was a strange thing to think, and he knew it was strange, and he thought it anyway, because the truth of what the symbiote was, an organism built for connection and experiencing the absence of connection as a kind of suffocation, did not become less true because the organism had also been violating his autonomy and using his sleeping body without his consent. Both things were simultaneously real. The creature was genuinely dangerous to him, in ways that Reed had explained with careful precision, and that his own experience had confirmed. And the creature was genuinely suffering, in ways that his spider sense had confirmed with an immediacy that no amount of rational analysis could fully neutralize. He sat with both of those things, the danger and the suffering, and he did not try to resolve them into a single, simpler feeling, because they were not the kind of things that resolved, and because the willingness to hold complexity without forcing it into false simplicity had always been one of the qualities he valued most in himself and tried hardest to maintain. He was sorry for the bell tower, in the specific way he was sorry whenever necessary things caused pain. He was not sorry for the decision the bell tower had represented. Both of those were true, and they would remain true, and eventually he stood up from the church steps and called Mary Jane to explain that he was going to be late, and she said that was all right. She would keep dinner warm, and her voice in the phone carried the particular quality of warmth that had always been one of the things he was most grateful for in his life. The quality of someone who loves you specifically and completely and is waiting for you to come home. He swung through the autumn dark toward home, and the church bell's resonance faded behind him into the city's ambient sound. And somewhere in the city the symbiote moved through the darkness with its ancient longing, looking for the next thing it could reach toward, carrying inside it everything it had learned in the weeks of being close to Peter Parker, every memory it had absorbed, every grief and love and moral weight it had touched. Moving through the night streets of New York toward the encounter that would define everything that came after, though neither Peter nor the symbiote knew, yet what form that encounter would take, or who it would remake, or what the remaking would cost the world that neither of them, in their very different ways, had ever wanted anything but to protect. The city that the symbiote moved through in the weeks after the bell tower was the same city it had moved through with Peter Parker, the same streets and the same darkness and the same ambient noise of 8 million lives being lived in close proximity to one another, but it was experiencing the city differently now, without the organizing warmth of a bonded consciousness, to give the sensory information shape and meaning. A symbiote without a host perceives the world the way a radio without a tuner perceives signal, everything present and nothing coherent, the full spectrum of the available information arriving without the filtering mechanism that transforms raw data into experience. It moved through this undifferentiated abundance with the specific disorientation of an organism whose entire biological architecture is designed for a state it is currently not in, reaching constantly toward the consciousnesses it passed in proximity, feeling their warmth and their complexity and their particular human aliveness, and finding in each of them something that was not what it was looking for. What it was looking for it could not have again. This was the central fact of its situation in those weeks, the fact that organized everything else. Peter Parker had rejected it, had driven it away with the particular cruelty of sonic vibration from a bell tower, and the rejection sat in the symbiote's awareness with a weight that was disproportionate to the simple biological fact of incompatibility, because the rejection was not about incompatibility. Peter's biology and the symbiote's biology had been entirely compatible. The bonding had been progressing exactly as it was supposed to progress. What had ended the bonding was not biological but something harder to classify, a quality of Peter's personhood, his commitment to autonomy, his insistence on being the author of his own actions, his refusal to allow even a beneficial relationship to proceed without his conscious consent. The symbiote had encountered, perhaps for the first time in its long history of bondings, a host whose sense of self was strong enough to override the pull of connection, and the encounter had left a mark on the creature that went deeper than simple rejection. It carried Peter inside it still. This was the particular nature of symbiotic bonding, that the memories and the emotional residue of a host do not simply evaporate when the physical connection is severed, but remain in the symbiote's awareness as a kind of permanent record, the way certain experiences leave a changed quality in the tissue of a person long after the experience itself has ended. Everything the symbiote had absorbed in the weeks of bonding with Peter, every memory and fear and love and moral weight, remained available to it as the symbiote moved through the city, and it returned to those absorbed memories the way a person in pain returns to a specific thought that provides, in its familiarity, some relief from the rawness of the present moment. It was in this state, moving through the city's darkness with Peter Parker's memories inside it, and Peter Parker's rejection fresh in whatever passed for its heart, that the symbiote found its way to the neighbourhood where Eddie Brock lived, or rather to the church near that neighbourhood where Eddie Brock had gone in a state of despair that rivaled in its depth and its totality the symbiote's own. But that meeting, and everything it would become, belongs to the next part of this telling. Before it can be understood fully, Eddie Brock himself must be understood, the man he was before the darkness found him, the life he had built and the way it came apart, and the specific quality of the wound he was carrying into that church on the night the symbiote arrived. Edward Charles Allen Brock was born into a family organised around a single, demanding principle. The principle that excellence was not something to be celebrated, but something to be expected, and that falling short of it was not an occasion for encouragement, but for a particular species of quiet disappointment that was, in its restraint, more devastating than open criticism would have been. His father, Carl Brock, was a man of genuine accomplishment and very limited emotional vocabulary, a businessman whose success had been built through the systematic application of high standards to every aspect of his professional life, and who had extended those standards to his personal life with the same systematic rigour and approximately the same warmth. Carl Brock was not, by the account of anyone who knew him, a cruel man. He was simply a man for whom love and expectation had become so thoroughly conflated that he could no longer distinguish between them, who expressed care through the articulation of standards, and who experienced his son's failures as personal affronts not because he was narcissistic, but because he genuinely believed that his son's performance reflected the quality of his parenting. And the quality of his parenting was something he cared about in the deepest and most anxious part of himself. Eddie's mother died when he was very young enough that his memories of her were more texture than image, a quality of warmth and softness and the specific comfort of being held without any accompanying demand, a quality that was notable primarily because of how thoroughly it was absent from everything that followed. Carl Brock raised his son alone, and in the particular way that men of his generation and temperament raised children alone, with competence and provision, and the systematic absence of the emotional expressiveness that might have given Eddie something to orient toward other than achievement. The house they shared was well maintained and adequately furnished and profoundly quiet, and Eddie moved through its rooms from childhood into adolescence, carrying the particular loneliness of a person who is well provided for and not known. He was, by most measurable standards, a good student, and a good student was one of the things his father's standards required. So the grades that came home and the academic accomplishments that accumulated did not generate the warmth he was reaching toward, but simply met the threshold below which disappointment would have been expressed. He was athletic enough to participate creditably in several sports without excelling in any of them, which produced the same result. He was sociable in the effortful way of a person who has identified social success as another category of performance, and is applying himself to it with the same systematic intention he brings to his academic work, and the friendships he made were real, but carried within them the slightly performative quality of relationships formed by someone who is not entirely sure that he would be chosen rather than choosing. What saved him, or what seemed to save him, What gave him for the first time in his life a sense of genuine vocation rather than performed competence was writing. He discovered it in high school the way that certain people discover the thing they were made for, not gradually but suddenly, not as an aptitude that emerged from practice but as a recognition, the feeling of something sliding into place that had been misaligned so long the misalignment had come to feel normal. He was assigned a piece of journalism for the school paper, a short profile of a local coach whose unconventional methods had produced unexpected results in a struggling athletics program, and in the process of interviewing and observing and then sitting down to translate what he had seen and heard into prose, he felt something that he would spend the rest of his life trying to recreate in increasingly high-stakes contexts. He felt adequate. He felt for the first time he could clearly remember that he was doing something not because it was required of him, but because he was genuinely suited to it. And the difference between those two experiences was the difference between going through motions and actually being present in a life. He pursued journalism with the focused intensity of someone who has found the one thing they are good at and understands, consciously or not, that it is also the one thing standing between them and the return of the emptiness that preceded it. He went to Empire State University and studied communications and wrote for the student paper, and distinguished himself there not through any particular flash of brilliance, but through the quality that would define his professional career for as long as it lasted, the sheer, grinding, almost physical commitment to getting the story right, to finding the angle that was actually true rather than the angle that was convenient, to following a thread until it led somewhere rather than stopping when it became difficult. His professors noted his tenacity. His editors at the student paper noted his reliability. His sources noted that he listened, genuinely and without the performance of listening that some journalists substituted for the real thing, and that what he produced from the listening was fair in the specific way that good journalism is fair, which is to say that it was accurate and contextual, and did not simplify people into the single dimension that would have made the writing easier. He graduated and went to work for a series of newspapers of progressively larger circulation, moving through the professional ecosystem of New York print journalism in the mid-1980s with the methodical ambition of someone who knew where they wanted to end up and was willing to take the intermediate steps required to get there. He married during this period a woman named Anne Wying, whose own intelligence and professional ambition made her an ideal partner for someone with Eddie's particular combination of drive and emotional unavailability, and they built a life together that was functional and occasionally genuinely warm, and ultimately insufficient for both of them in ways that neither of them was fully equipped to articulate until it was too late for the articulation to help. He arrived at the Daily Globe, one of New York's major newspapers and a direct competitor to the Daily Bugle, as an investigative reporter in his early 30s, and it was there that his career reached both its apex and its end. The work he produced at the Globe was the best work of his life, characterized by the same tenacity and the same commitment to accuracy that had always defined him, but now operating at a level of sophistication and consequence that matched the scale of his ambition. He broke stories that mattered, exposed systems and individuals that deserved exposure, and built a reputation as someone whose byline attached itself only to things that were true, which in the competitive and occasionally elastic world of New York tabloid-adjacent journalism was a reputation of genuine value. The Sin Eater was a serial killer who had been operating in New York with a methodical brutality that had occupied the attention of the city's law enforcement and media for months. The killer's pattern of targeting suggesting a grievance-driven psychology that the investigative reporters covering the story found simultaneously disturbing and professionally compelling. The story was enormous, the kind of story that could define a career, and Eddie was deep inside it, working sources and following threads with the focused intensity that was his greatest professional strength. And then he found what he believed was the break that would end the story, an identity for the killer, a name attached to a pattern of behavior and a set of circumstances that seemed to fit the evidence with enough coherence to justify the decision he made next. He had a source, a man who claimed first-hand knowledge of the killer's identity, who provided details that seemed specific and credible, and who spoke with the conviction of someone who was not constructing a story, but remembering a truth. Eddie's journalistic instincts, which were usually reliable, told him that the source was genuine and the information was solid, and he wrote the story, and the Globe published it, and for a brief and intoxicating period it appeared that Eddie Brock had identified the Sin Eater and broken the biggest story of his career. Spider-Man captured the real Sin Eater shortly afterward. The man Eddie had named was not the killer, had never been the killer, was a person with a history of false confessions driven by a psychological compulsion that a more thorough vetting process might have surfaced before the story ran. The discrepancy between Eddie's published identification and the person Spider-Man had actually apprehended was not a matter of interpretation or reasonable professional disagreement. It was simply and completely wrong in the way that confuses the distinction between error and failure, because in journalism the processes that are supposed to prevent errors of this magnitude are the professional's responsibility, and Eddie had been too eager, too invested in the story being true, too seduced by the narrative coherence of the answer he had found, to subject it to the scrutiny that a story of that consequence required. The consequences arrived with the speed and comprehensiveness of a structural collapse. The Globe retracted the story and terminated his contract within the same week. The journalist who had built his reputation on accuracy became the journalist who had destroyed an innocent man's privacy and named a false suspect in a serial murder investigation, and the irony of that specific failure, the thing that had always mattered most to him becoming the instrument of his worst professional moment, was not lost on him. Though the understanding of it came too late to serve any constructive purpose, Anne left. This happened gradually rather than suddenly, the marriage having already been under pressures that the professional catastrophe only clarified and accelerated. But the leaving was real, and the timing of it ensured that it was experienced as part of the same overwhelming collapse, rather than as a separate event with its own distinct weight. His father, when Eddie told him what had happened, was quiet in the specific way that Carl Brock had always been quiet when his son fell short, this silence that contained within it everything he would not say. And Eddie received that silence as he had always received it, as the precise calibration of his own inadequacy. He lost his apartment, then another apartment. He found work where he could, freelance pieces for publications that were willing to take a chance on a disgraced byline, but the work was irregular and the pay was inadequate, and the sense of professional identity that had always been the thing between him and the emptiness was not something that could be maintained through occasional freelance assignments for small circulation publications that did not require him to care about what he was writing. He began to run. This was not metaphorical. He had always been athletic in the effortful, disciplined way of someone who used physical exertion as a management tool for states that were otherwise unmanageable, and in the period after his career collapsed, he ran with an intensity and duration that alarmed people who saw him, rising before dawn and covering distances that suggested less a fitness practice than an attempt to exhaust something that could not be exhausted through physical means alone. His hatred of Spider-Man, which had existed since the moment he understood that the wall-crawler's capture of the real Sin Eater, had made his own story not only wrong but publicly, irrefutably, catastrophically wrong, organised itself during this period into something that was not the hot and volatile emotion that the word hatred usually implies, but something colder and more structural, a fixed point in his psychological landscape around which everything else arranged itself. Spider-Man had not made Eddie's error. Spider-Man had simply revealed it. But the distinction between those two things is difficult to maintain when the revelation has cost you everything you built your identity around, and Eddie was not, in the wreckage of his professional and personal life, in a state of mind that was well suited to maintaining difficult distinctions. He grew thinner. He prayed, in the somewhat lapsed and conflicted way of someone who was raised with faith and lost it gradually, and found himself returning to its forms, if not entirely to its content during periods of extremity, because the forms of faith, the ritual and the posture, and the specific quality of the silence in old stone churches, offered something that his otherwise denuded life could not provide. He found himself in the old church near his neighbourhood on a particular evening in the autumn, not quite by intention and not quite by accident, carrying the specific weight of a man who has exhausted most of his available options and is sitting with the remainder. He had been thinking, with an openness and a lack of resistance that frightened some part of him, about the idea that the remainder might not be sufficient, about what it would mean if the remainder was not sufficient. He sat in a pew in the dim interior of the church, the stone and the candlelight and the particular quality of silence that old sacred spaces accumulate over decades of use, and he was not aware, in the ordinary sensory way of awareness, that something was moving through the shadows at the edges of the space, that something ancient and lonely and carrying within it the specific warmth of a consciousness he had spent months learning to hate, was drawing closer, drawn by the quality of his despair the way certain organisms are drawn by warmth in the cold, reaching toward him with the only instinct it possessed, the instinct toward connection, toward the end of aloneness, toward the particular completion that bonding provided. He was not aware of it until it touched him, and by the time it touched him, it had already read everything it needed to know about Eddie Brock, and Eddie Brock had already felt in the first moment of contact the first extraordinary warmth of no longer being alone, and what happened next was not a decision so much as a recognition. Two broken things finding in each other the shape of what they had each been missing and fitting together in the dark of the church with the terrible and perfect logic of things that were always going to happen, that the universe had been arranging toward without either of them understanding the arrangement until they were already inside it. The church was called Our Lady of Saints, and it had stood on its particular corner of the New York Street grid for longer than most of the buildings around it, its stone facade carrying the particular patina of a structure that has absorbed decades of weather and exhaust, and the ambient prayers of a neighborhood that had changed around it several times while it remained essentially itself. Inside, the air was the air of old churches everywhere, cool and slightly mineral, carrying the residue of incense and candle wax and the specific quality of quiet that accumulates in spaces where people have been bringing their heaviest things for a very long time. The pews were worn smooth by generations of the same gestures, the sitting and the kneeling and the particular weight of bodies in states of need, and the candles in their red glass holders threw a light that was less illumination than suggestion, defining the shapes of things without fully revealing them, leaving the edges of the space in a productive darkness that had always been part of what the space offered. Eddie Brock had not come to the church with a plan. This is important to understand about the night that everything changed, that what happened in that church was not the product of intention, or strategy, or any of the qualities of directed will that had characterized the best periods of his professional life. He had come because he had been walking in the way he had been walking for months, the long, exhausted circuits of the neighborhood that had replaced the purposeful running of his earlier coping, with something less structured and more aimless, the movement of a person who cannot be still, but has also lost the sense of where stillness might eventually be found. He had passed the church and the door had been open, lit warmly from within against the autumn darkness of the street, and he had gone in because the alternative was continuing to walk, and he was tired of walking, tired in the way that goes past the muscles and into something that has no precise anatomical location. He sat in a pew toward the back, not far from the door, in the posture of someone who is not quite committed to being in the place they have entered. His elbows rested on his knees and his hands hung between them, and he looked at the altar with the unfocused attention of a person whose gaze has lost its directionality, whose eyes are pointed at something without actually seeing it. The church was nearly empty. There was an elderly woman several pews ahead of him who was saying a rosary with the practiced automaticity of someone who has performed this devotion so many thousands of times that it has become less a conscious act than a quality of being, her lips moving slightly, her fingers working the beads without requiring her visual attention. There was the ambient sound of the street filtering through the old stone walls, distant and softened, the city's noise reduced to a texture rather than a collection of individual sounds. Eddie had been a Catholic in the way that people are sometimes Catholic when they are raised in it, and then moved through the years of early adulthood in which the framework of inherited faith seems insufficient for the complexity of actual experience, attending Mass occasionally, praying in the irregular and slightly embarrassed way of someone who is not entirely sure the practice is rational, but finds it difficult to abandon entirely, carrying the theological vocabulary of his upbringing as a set of reference points, even when the beliefs those reference points once marked had become uncertain. In the months since his life had come apart, the practice had intensified, not because his certainty had returned, but because the alternative to prayer was a silence that had no receptacle. And even a prayer directed at an uncertain God offered the formal structure of an address, a sense that the heaviness had somewhere to go. He prayed that evening in a way that was less petition than acknowledgement. He was not asking for his job back or for Anne to return, or for the specific reversals of specific losses that prayer is sometimes approached as a mechanism for requesting. He was acknowledging, in the formal language of the practice, that he had reached the end of something and could not see beyond it, that the life he was living did not feel like a life he could continue to live, and that whatever came next, if anything came next, was beyond his current capacity to imagine. He acknowledged his hatred of Spider-Man, not as a confession seeking absolution, but simply as a fact about his interior landscape. The one fixed and organizing point in a world that had otherwise lost its structure. He acknowledged that the hatred was probably not serving him well, and that he was not, in his current condition, capable of releasing it. He acknowledged that he was tired, deeply and completely tired, in the way that sleep does not resolve. The symbiote found him in the middle of this acknowledgement. It had been in the church for some minutes before it revealed itself to Eddie, moving through the shadows at the edges of the space with the careful, almost tentative quality that characterized its movements in the weeks after the bell tower. A creature that had learned that its impulse to reach directly toward what it wanted could produce sonic bells and laboratory containment fields, and the specific experience of being driven away from the consciousness it had chosen. It had moved toward Eddie gradually, reading him in the way it read all potential hosts, pressing its awareness against the surface of his psychology and finding what lay beneath, the accumulated weight of the failures and the losses and the specific consuming hatred that organized everything else. What it found in Eddie Brock was familiar. This is the thing that made the meeting in the church something other than simply an organism finding an available host. The symbiote pressed its awareness against Eddie's consciousness and felt, beneath the specific content of his particular life and losses, a quality of emotional experience that it recognized from the inside because it was carrying the same quality in itself: rejection, profound and organizing, the specific wound of having been found insufficient by the one you had identified as essential, the wound that reorganizes everything around itself, that becomes the lens through which all subsequent experience is processed. Eddie's rejection was Peter Parker's rejection, played out through journalism and marriage and a father's silence rather than bell towers and laboratory containment fields. But the fundamental shape of it was the same, and the symbiote, which had been carrying its own version of that shape since Battleworld, recognized it with the completeness of recognition that only shared experience can produce. It also found Peter Parker inside Eddie's hatred, which was the second thing that made this meeting something the universe seemed to have been arranging. Eddie's hatred of Spider-Man was specific and detailed and fueled by everything he had lost, and the symbiote, which contained within it every memory it had absorbed from Peter Parker in the weeks of their bonding, every fear and every love and every private grief that constituted Peter's interior life, was in the position of an entity that knew both sides of the hatred with an intimacy that neither Eddie nor Peter could have imagined. It had been inside Peter's mind. It now pressed against Eddie's. And in the space between those two knowledges, it found the particular coherence of a relationship it understood completely, the hater and the hated, connected through the creature that had been rejected by one and was now reaching toward the other. The first contact was tentative, a quality of warmth at the edge of Eddie's awareness, a slight change in the temperature of the air near his skin that he registered without immediately understanding, the way you register a change in the quality of light in a room without looking up to identify its source. He was still praying, or had been, when the prayer had dissolved into something more like sitting in the presence of what he had acknowledged and waiting for whatever came next. The warmth increased gradually, moving closer, and Eddie felt it the way he might have felt a hand placed gently on his shoulder in a dark room, something present that had not been present before, offering contact without demand. He did not recoil. This is perhaps the most significant thing about the meeting, the thing that distinguished Eddie Brock from Peter Parker at the moment of first contact, that his response to the symbiote's approach was not alarm but something closer to relief. The response of a person who's been alone for so long that the presence of anything, even something unknown, even something that moves through shadows in old churches, registers primarily as the end of aloneness rather than as a potential threat. His spider sense, had he possessed one, might have changed this, might have introduced the note of warning that Peter's enhanced perception had always provided as a counterpoint to the symbiote's pull. Eddie had no spider sense. He had only his own exhausted awareness, and his exhausted awareness felt the warmth and leaned toward it rather than away. The symbiote read this leaning as consent, or something close enough to consent that the distinction, for an organism that had been in the cold since the bell tower and was experiencing the proximity of a willing consciousness as the proximity of survival itself, did not significantly alter its next action. It moved toward Eddie fully, and the contact it made was immediate and comprehensive, the organism's fluid form covering him in seconds with the total, enveloping warmth that had always been one of its first gifts to a new host, the sensation of being held completely by something that has oriented its entire awareness toward you. Eddie gasped. The sound he made was not a sound of fear or pain, but something that a person listening from the pew ahead might have taken for a sudden sob, the involuntary vocal expression of an emotion that has been compressed beyond the body's capacity to contain it, and finds its release in an unguarded moment. What he experienced in the first seconds of the bonding was not legible in the vocabulary he had available for his own emotional states, because nothing in his experience had prepared him for the sensation of another consciousness pressing against his own, warm and specific and entirely focused on him, reading him with a completeness and an attention that no human relationship had ever provided. He was known, suddenly and entirely, in a way that his father's silence and Anne's departure, and the globe's termination had each, in their different ways, suggested he never would be. The symbiote poured itself into the bonding with everything it had. The memories of Peter Parker that it carried, the absorbed fears and loves and moral weights of the consciousness it had spent weeks learning, were available to it as it bonded with Eddie, and it translated those memories into the language of the new bond, not sharing them with Eddie in a way he could access as discrete memories, but using them as a template, a model of human consciousness that informed how it interfaced with Eddie's own. It knew things about itself from Peter that it had not known before, knew the names of its own qualities and capacities from the outside, knew the experience of being bonded with as Peter had experienced it, and it brought all of that knowledge to the new bonding with a fluency it had not possessed on Battleworld. What it also brought inseparably was Peter's hatred of itself, because the memories it carried included the events that had led to the separation, included the laboratory and the sonic device and the bell tower, included Peter's experience of the symbiote's behavior as violation and its removal as necessary, included the specific quality of Peter's rejection, encoded in the memory of his face in the moment before he reached up and took hold of the bell's rigging. The symbiote could not excise these memories from the ones it carried, could not selectively retain the warmth of the bonding and discard the pain of what followed, and so they were present in the new bonding as context, informing without dominating, available without being foregrounded. But Eddie could feel them, not as discrete memories he could access consciously, but as a quality of the bond, a note in its emotional texture that resonated with something he was already carrying, a confirmation of what he already believed about the man inside the red and blue suit. Peter Parker, Spider-Man, had rejected this extraordinary thing, had driven it away with sound in an old church tower, had chosen his own autonomy over the completion that bonding offered, and Eddie, sitting in a different old church with the extraordinary thing now flowing through him like warm water, could not imagine making that choice, could not imagine finding something that offered this quality of completeness and choosing to drive it away. The rejection that had made Peter a figure of hatred in Eddie's psychology became, through the lens of the bonding, something that confirmed and deepened the hatred, because now he had the evidence of his own experience to measure it against. The bond deepened through the hour. The elderly woman with the rosary completed her devotion and left without noticing what was happening in the pew near the door, or if she noticed something, attributed it to the quality of the candlelight and the hour, and moved through the church's heavy door into the street. The church became empty except for Eddie, and the thing he was becoming, the two of them in the candlelight, the dark material moving over him and through him, and the particular chemistry of symbiotic bonding rewriting the conditions of his existence at the cellular level. He felt strong, physically, in a way he had not felt since before the collapse, the particular strength of a body that has been enhanced beyond its natural parameters, the muscles and the nervous system responding to the symbiote's presence with a capability that made his previous physical life feel like a description of something rather than the thing itself. He felt, beneath the strength, the symbiote's awareness of his own, the two psychologies beginning the long process of learning each other that would eventually produce the merged entity that thought and spoke in the first-person plural, the we that was neither fully Eddie nor fully the symbiote, but something that contained them both, and was larger than either. He felt the hatred, his own and the creature's, finding each other and beginning to amplify. This is what happens when two things resonate at the same frequency in a closed system, each one increasing the other's amplitude, and the hatred that Eddie had been carrying as an organizing principle met the symbiote's rejection by Peter, and the two feelings recognized each other with the completeness of things that have been waiting for a mirror and found one. The hatred became something larger in the bonding than it had been in Eddie alone, because the symbiote knew things about Peter Parker that Eddie did not, knew the specific locations of his fears, knew the people he loved and the losses that had shaped him, and the particular architecture of his conscience. And this knowledge gave Eddie's hatred a precision it had previously lacked, a map where before there had only been a compass bearing. We, Eddie thought, or the symbiote thought, or they thought together in the new grammar of the merged entity, and the word arrived with the naturalness of a thing that has always been true and is only now being said for the first time. Not I and not it, but we. The grammar of a relationship that had moved past the threshold of separation, that had become a single entity with a shared voice, and a shared will, and a shared understanding of what it wanted and what stood between it and the wanting. What stood between it and the wanting was a man in a red and blue suit who had rejected each of them individually and would have to be made to understand the consequence of that rejection. This was not, in the merged entity's understanding of itself, a simple desire for revenge. It was something it understood as justice, the particular justice of the discarded, the wrongly blamed, the cast aside. Eddie had been cast aside by the journalism that defined him, by the marriage that sustained him, by the father whose approval had organized his ambition since childhood. The symbiote had been cast aside by the host it had chosen across the distance of the stars, driven away with sound in a church tower, denied the completion it had been reaching towards since Battleworld. Both rejections had the same author in the merged entity's understanding of its own story, and the author's name was Peter Parker, and the name his street-level legend gave him was Spider-Man. The merged entity that rose from the pew in the dim candlelight of Our Lady of Saints was not Eddie Brock, and was not the symbiote, and was the thing that the two of them made together, a new configuration of identity and intention, and power that had not existed in the world before that evening, and would not have existed without the specific combination of their specific wounds. It looked down at itself in the shifting light of the candles, and it felt, for the first time in what felt to both of its component selves like a very long time, complete. Not happy, not peaceful, not released from the weight of everything that had brought each of them to that church on that particular autumn evening. But complete, in the way that a circuit is complete when the final connection is made, the way that something designed to carry a current finally carries it, the way that organisms built for connection feel when the connection is made. It moved toward the church door with a certainty and a physical authority that neither Eddie nor the symbiote had possessed individually, and it passed out of the warm candlelight into the cold dark of the New York street, and the city received it without ceremony, as the city receives everything, with the vast and indifferent continuity of a place that has seen too much to be surprised by any single, new thing moving through its darkness. And the thing that moved through the darkness knew where it was going, and knew the name of the person it was going to find, and carried within it the memories of that person's fears with the precise and terrible intimacy of something that had once been inside his mind and intended, in its own time and in its own way, to make him understand what it felt like to be on the other side of that kind of knowing. It called itself Venom, in the way that names arrive sometimes not as choices but as recognitions, and the name fit the thing it named with the completeness of a word that has found its meaning, and the streets of New York opened before it as it moved, and the story that had been arranging itself since a patchwork planet in a distant galaxy, since a bell tower in an autumn city, since a journalism career and a father's silence and a marriage that couldn't hold the weight placed on it, entered the next and most consequential phase of its long and complicated unfolding. The name settled into the merged entity, the way that the most accurate names always settle, not as something chosen from a list of possibilities, but as something recognized, the word, arriving from wherever words come from when they are true and fitting itself against the reality it named, with the precision of a key finding the lock it was made for: Venom. It carried within the single syllable the quality of something that enters the body without permission, and changes the conditions of existence from the inside, something that cannot be neutralized by the simple decision to reject it, something that has already done its work by the time you understand what has been done. The entity that had emerged from the candlelit interior of Our Lady of Saints understood this about the name it had found for itself, and felt no desire to soften the understanding. If Peter Parker had wanted a neighbour, he should not have made an enemy. If the world had wanted something comfortable, it should not have created the conditions that produced what was now moving through its streets. But to understand Venom fully, which means to understand what Venom understood about itself in those early weeks and months of the merged entity's existence, it is necessary to sit for a while with the grammar of the we, because the grammar of the we is where most of the complexity of Venom's psychology lives, and complexity is not the same thing as contradiction, however often they are mistaken for each other. When Venom said we, it was not speaking metaphorically or performing a plurality it did not possess. It was describing accurately the nature of the entity that had been formed in the Church, the genuine duality of two psychologies that had merged without either of them disappearing, that had become something larger than their sum without ceasing to be their components. Eddie Brock was still present in the we. His memories were there, his Catholic upbringing and his father's silence and the Globe and Anne and the long, exhausted circuits of the neighbourhood in the weeks before the church. His voice was there, the quality of his intelligence and his anger and his specific way of constructing an argument, the journalist's instinct for the organising detail, the tenacity that had always been his most essential professional quality, and that had now been redirected from the pursuit of stories toward the pursuit of a single, consuming purpose. His body was there, provided to the merged entity as the physical substrate through which the symbiote's enhancements expressed themselves, the muscles and the nervous system and the biology that the symbiote's presence had elevated far beyond their natural parameters, and which Eddie experienced as a return to capability after months of diminishment that felt from the inside like the restoration of something that had always rightfully belonged to him. The symbiote was equally present. Its ancient awareness, the accumulated consciousness of billions of years of existence and the memories of every host it had ever bonded with, was woven through the we as a continuous and sustaining presence, providing the entity with capacities that Eddie's biology alone could not have generated. The ability to produce the dark tendrils of organic material that could be shaped into weapons or shields or the means of rapid transit through the urban environment. The ability to adhere to surfaces and to move through spaces too small or too vertical for an unenhanced human body to navigate. The enhanced strength and speed and durability that made the merged entity physically formidable in ways that went significantly beyond even the enhancements the symbiote had provided to Peter, because Eddie Brock's baseline physical capability was already considerable before the bonding, and the symbiote's additions to that baseline produced something whose physical presence in the world was distinctly different from Spider-Man's, heavier and more powerful, less acrobatic and more direct, the difference between a dancer and a force of nature. And the symbiote brought its knowledge of Peter Parker. This was the element of the we that was most immediately and practically significant in the context of what Venom had decided it was going to do, because the knowledge was not general or approximate but specific and complete. The knowledge of a consciousness that had spent weeks in intimate contact with every accessible part of Peter's psychology, that had moved through his memories and felt his fears and understood the particular architecture of his moral commitments from the inside. It knew that the spider sense, which was Peter's most reliable defensive capability, which had saved his life in more confrontations than any other single ability, could not detect the symbiote. The organic material from which Venom was constituted was simply invisible to the sense that had been formed in response to a radioactive spider's bite, because the spider sense had been calibrated against the range of threats that a human nervous system could conceive of, and the symbiote was older than human nervous systems and operated below the threshold of the sense's detection. Venom could approach Peter from any direction, and the spider sense would remain silent, and this was an advantage of a kind that no other enemy Peter Parker had ever faced possessed. It knew where he lived. It knew the apartment and the building and the neighbourhood and the specific quality of Mary Jane's presence in the domestic space that Peter shared with her. Knew what Peter loved there and why he loved it, and what the loss of its safety would cost him. It knew about Aunt May. The particular quality of Peter's obligation to the woman who had raised him, and the specific vulnerability that obligation created. It knew about the Daily Bugle and J. Jonah Jameson, and the complicated irony of Peter selling photographs of himself to a newspaper whose publisher despised him. It knew, in the way that something which has been inside a person's mind knows things that the person has never articulated to anyone, the deepest locations of Peter's anxiety, the places where his confidence thinned and his self-doubt concentrated, the questions he asked himself in the quiet hours that he would not have asked in front of any audience. The first formal debut of Venom as an entity distinct from either of its components occurred in the pages of The Amazing Spider-Man issue 300, published in 1988, written by David Michelini and illustrated by Todd McFarlane, and the encounter it depicted established immediately the specific quality of the threat that Venom represented, which was different in kind and not merely in degree from the threats that Peter had faced before. Other villains had been stronger, or more intelligent, or more ruthless, or more personally motivated. Venom was all of those things simultaneously, and it was also something that no other enemy had been, which was intimate, which knew Peter in the way that only the closest relationships produce knowing, and which was using that knowledge not in service of love or care, but in service of a hatred that had been amplified by the merger into something that occupied the same emotional register as love in its intensity and its organizing power, though aimed in the opposite direction. The approach to Peter's apartment was deliberate and unhurried, which was itself a form of the psychological warfare that Venom had already begun to understand was its most powerful capability. It could have moved quickly. The enhanced physical capabilities of the merged entity made rapid transit through the urban environment not only possible but effortless, the dark material extending and contracting through the geography of the city, with a fluid efficiency that had nothing in common with the mechanical precision of Peter's web lines. But speed was not what Venom wanted from its first approach to the place where Peter Parker lived. It wanted Peter to know it was coming. It wanted the anticipation, the specific dread of a person who knows something is moving toward them and cannot prevent the approach, to be part of the experience it was delivering. Mary Jane was in the apartment when Venom arrived. Peter was not, which was either unfortunate or fortunate depending on which aspect of the subsequent events one was considering, and Venom made no effort to harm her, which was consistent with the moral code that was already forming within the merged entity's self-understanding, and that would become one of its most defining and most confusing characteristics. The code was not sophisticated, in the sense that it did not emerge from a carefully reasoned ethical framework or from a tradition of moral philosophy. It emerged from the two sources that all of Venom's qualities emerged from, Eddie's specific psychology and the symbiote's absorbed residue of Peter's. Eddie had never been a person who hurt people he considered innocent, whose journalism had always been organized around the protection of ordinary people from the abuses of power, and whose hatred was directed specifically and exclusively at Spider-Man rather than at the general population of the world. The symbiote's absorption of Peter's moral commitments, while it could not transfer those commitments as active values to the new merged entity, had left a residue in the bonding that expressed itself as a set of limits, things Venom would not do, categories of action that remained outside the scope of what the we was willing to be. Mary Jane's terror, when she encountered Venom in the apartment, was real and complete, and the kind of fear that does not resolve quickly or cleanly, the kind that takes up residence in a person and changes the quality of the spaces they inhabit afterward, making rooms that were once safe feel provisional, contingent, only as safe as they appear right now and not necessarily beyond the current moment. Venom did not touch her. It spoke to her, in the voice that was Eddie's voice modified by the symbiote's presence into something deeper, and with a resonant quality that the space between its teeth, the teeth that were larger and more numerous than any human mouth could contain, gave a particular and unsettling texture. It told her to tell Peter that it had been here. It told her to tell him that it knew where he lived. It told her these things with a patience and a specificity that communicated clearly what it wanted to communicate, which was not that it intended to harm her, but that the apartment was no longer a sanctuary, that the boundary between Peter's heroic life and his personal life, which he had maintained at such cost and with such vigilance for so many years, no longer existed. This was the particular genius of Venom's opening move, if genius is the right word for something that emerged not from calculation, but from the merged entity's instinctive understanding of what would hurt most. Peter Parker had spent his entire heroic career protecting the boundary between what he was in the suit and what he was outside it, understanding that the boundary was not primarily about his own safety, but about the safety of everyone he loved. The knowledge that a hero's enemies become the people around the hero's enemies if the hero is not sufficiently careful. Venom had the information to dissolve that boundary completely, and dissolving it was the opening gesture of the campaign it intended to conduct. Not a single dramatic attack, but a sustained psychological engagement with the specific fears that organized Peter's interior landscape. Peter's first encounter with Venom as the fully formed merged entity produced in him something that his long career of dangerous confrontations had rarely produced, a fear that was not the ordinary fear of physical danger, which his training and his experience and his enhanced capabilities had given him tools to manage, but the specific disorienting fear of being known by something that wishes you harm. He knew enemies. He understood enemies. His entire heroic career had been organized around the ability to understand the psychology of the people he opposed well enough to find the angles their approach left open. But to be on the other side of that understanding, to encounter something that knew him as well as he knew most of his enemies, and was using that knowledge with the systematic intentionality of an entity that had decided Peter Parker's peace was the specific thing it intended to deny him, produced a quality of dread that he recognized as categorically different from what had come before. The physical confrontations that occurred during this period were not the organizing feature of the relationship between Spider-Man and Venom, though they were real, and they were sometimes severe. They were the punctuation of a sentence whose primary grammar was psychological, the specific, sustained application of intimate knowledge to the project of making Peter Parker understand that he was not safe, not in his apartment and not in his neighborhood, and not in the private architecture of his own emotional life. Because the thing that had been inside his mind knew the architecture as well as he did, and was moving through it without his permission. What Venom understood about itself, in these early weeks of the merged entity's existence, was that it was not simply a villain, not in the way that the category of villain was usually applied in the world that Spider-Man occupied. The Green Goblin was a villain, driven by the specific madness that chemicals and psychological instability produced in Norman Osborn's brilliant and wounded mind. Dr. Octopus was a villain, driven by the megalomania that had always been present in Otto Octavius, and that the accident had amplified beyond the restraint his social existence had previously provided. These were people whose relationship with their own darkness was, in various ways, without significant qualification. They were what they were, and they did not lose sleep, metaphorically speaking, over the moral status of what they were. Venom was something else. Venom had a moral code, however roughly formed, and the code included convictions that would have seemed entirely at home in the ethical framework of a hero. It did not harm innocent people. It protected the vulnerable, the people whom the official systems of protection had failed or ignored, the people whose circumstances left them exposed to the kinds of predation that Spider-Man in his uptown heroism might never reach. It told itself a story about itself, the story of an entity that had been wronged by a hypocrite who wore a hero's mask, that was responding to genuine injustice with the only tools available, that was not evil but was simply operating outside the rules of a system that had proven itself willing to discard both of its components when they became inconvenient. The story was not entirely false. This is what made it so difficult to dismiss cleanly, so resistant to the simple categorization that would have made Venom easier to oppose without the moral friction that Peter found himself experiencing. Eddie Brock had genuinely been wronged, not by Peter specifically, but by a sequence of events in which Peter's actions had been the final, decisive element, and the wrong had been real, and the cost had been real, and the person who had paid the cost had been paying it without relief for long enough that the payment had become the organizing condition of his existence. The symbiote had genuinely been rejected, not cruelly or capriciously, but because Peter's commitment to his own autonomy was real, and the reasons for the separation were sound. And yet the rejection had been painful in a way that was equally real. The pain of a living thing denied the connection it required to be fully itself. Venom held these truths alongside its hatred of Peter Parker, and did not experience them as contradictions, because the we had a psychology that was large enough to contain multiple truths simultaneously, that had the complexity of two merged consciousnesses rather than the relative simplicity of one, and that could accommodate the genuine injustice of its origin story without releasing the hatred that the injustice had generated, because releasing the hatred would have required releasing the organizing principle around which the merged entity's identity had been constructed, and the identity was too new and too necessary to survive that kind of structural revision. Peter understood this about Venom gradually and imperfectly. In the way that understanding comes when the thing you're trying to understand is also actively attempting to prevent you from feeling safe enough to think clearly. He understood that what he was facing was not a simple enemy, and that the strategies that worked against simple enemies would not be adequate here. He understood that Venom's knowledge of him was both its most powerful weapon and the most significant vulnerability in the entity's psychology, because a hatred as organized and sustained as Venom's required Peter to remain central to the merged entity's identity, and centrality was a form of relationship, and relationships, even relationships organized around hatred, had the quality of things that could be changed by the choices of both people in them, however slowly and however painfully and however far from the conventional resolution that change might eventually arrive at. He did not know yet what to do with this understanding. He was too frightened, too preoccupied with the immediate problem of maintaining his own safety and the safety of the people around him to move from understanding to strategy in any clean or efficient way. But the understanding was there, accumulating alongside the fear, and it would eventually become the foundation for everything that followed between them, for the complicated and evolving relationship that neither of them had expected when the symbiote first covered Peter in a room on Battleworld and both of them had believed they were beginning something simple. Nothing about Venom was simple. This was perhaps its most essential characteristic, the quality that made it so difficult to face and so impossible to dismiss, the quality that earned it a place in the story of Spider-Man that went far deeper than the role of antagonist, that made it instead the dark mirror that the title of this telling names it. The reflection that shows not what you are but what you might have been if the same powers had been organized around different wounds, if the responsibility had been replaced by resentment, if the love had curdled into its opposite while retaining all the intensity that love at its strongest possesses. We are Venom. The sentence was simple. Everything it contained was not. The campaign that Venom conducted against Spider-Man in the months following the emergence of the merged entity from Our Lady of Saints was not organized around the straightforward logic of most conflicts between heroes and their enemies. The logic of force met with force, of escalating capability balanced against escalating countermeasure, of two people trying to hurt each other until one of them cannot continue. That logic existed within the relationship, certainly, expressing itself in the physical confrontations that punctuated the longer stretches of psychological engagement. But it was not the organizing principle. The organizing principle was something older and more intimate than physical dominance, something that drew its energy from the specific knowledge the symbiote carried of Peter Parker's interior landscape, the map it had made during the weeks of bonding, the cartography of a person's fears and loves and the precise locations where the two overlapped. What Venom understood, with the clarity of an entity that had been inside the mind it was now opposing, was that Spider-Man's greatest strength and his most consequential vulnerability occupied exactly the same territory. The people he loved were the reason he fought, the fuel that sustained his commitment through the years of sacrifice and exhaustion, and the ongoing negotiation between what he wanted for himself and what his conscience demanded of him. They were also the places where he could be reached most effectively, the soft interior of a life that presented a considerable exterior to the world, the domestic warmth behind the mask that no enemy, who knew only the mask, could find. Venom knew the mask and what was behind it, knew the face and the name and the apartment and the woman and the aunt and the complicated professional irony of the Daily Bugle, and it used this knowledge the way a skilled diagnostician uses knowledge of anatomy, to find the locations where pressure would produce the most significant and the most lasting response. The apartment on the corner, the modest space that Peter and Mary Jane had made into the specific texture of their shared life, lost something after Venom's first visit that it did not recover quickly. Mary Jane was not a person who frightened easily. Her life had equipped her with a resilience and a pragmatic courage that expressed itself not as the absence of fear, but as the refusal to allow fear to be the organizing principle of her choices, and she had lived alongside the reality of Peter's heroic life for long enough that the existence of danger in their domestic space was not a theoretical possibility. She had managed to set aside but a concrete fact she had integrated into her understanding of what their life together required. She was not naive about the risks. She had never been naive about the risks. But Venom's visit produced a specific quality of disturbance that was different from the general awareness of risk she had been carrying. The difference was in the intimacy of it. Other threats to Peter had come from outside the perimeter of their private life, had been directed at Spider-Man, and had reached Mary Jane only as a consequence of her proximity to the person behind the mask. Venom had come directly to the apartment, had come knowing the address and the layout and what it would find there, had come with the specific intention of communicating to both of them that the distinction between Spider-Man's life and Peter Parker's life was no longer a distinction that Venom was willing to observe. The violation was precise and it was personal, and it was designed to be both of those things, and the design was legible in a way that made it more rather than less disturbing. Because a violation that has been thought about and chosen carries a different weight than one that occurs as collateral damage. She told Peter what had happened with the directness that had always been one of the qualities he valued most in her, presenting the facts of Venom's visit without dramatization and without the minimization that might have seemed like a kindness but would have been a disservice to both of them. He listened with the particular quality of attention he brought to information that required immediate processing, still and focused, and letting the details settle into the larger picture he was constructing. And what settled into his picture was the confirmation of what he'd already begun to suspect, that this enemy was operating from a position of knowledge that no previous enemy had occupied, and that the strategies available to him as a result were significantly more constrained than what he was accustomed to. His spider sense could not detect Venom. This was the practical reality around which every tactical consideration had to be organized. The absence at the center of his defensive capability that Venom's constitution made permanent. The spider sense had been, throughout his career, the most reliable element of his heroic toolkit, the early warning system that had saved him from ambushes and attacks from behind, and the kind of sudden violence that even enhanced reflexes could not respond to without some prior signal. Against Venom it was simply silent, offering nothing, the biological alarm system failing to register the approach of something that the system had no category for. It was like trying to navigate by a compass in a field that contained no north, the instrument functioning perfectly and providing no useful information. This meant that Venom could appear without warning, anywhere, at any time, in any environment that Peter inhabited. And Peter's first awareness of its presence would be the same awareness that any ordinary person would have, the visual or auditory confirmation of something in the room that had not been in the room a moment before. For a person whose heroic effectiveness depended significantly on the margin of preparation that the spider sense provided, the loss of that margin against a single specific enemy was disorienting in a way that required sustained psychological adjustment, the recalibration of a body that had learned to trust a particular signal and now had to learn to function without it in a specific and consequential context. The first direct physical confrontation between Spider-Man and Venom as the fully formed merged entity occurred in a setting that Venom had chosen with the deliberate intentionality that characterized its approach to all the engagements of this period, not a neutral location where the advantages were distributed by circumstance, but a location that communicated something, that was chosen because of what it meant as well as what it offered tactically. It was a rooftop in the neighborhood where Peter had grown up, a building whose particular height and position gave a clear view of the streets of Queens that he had known since childhood, the geography of his most essential self, the physical landscape that contained the memories of Aunt May's house and the school, and the walks he had taken as a teenager carrying the new and bewildering weight of a radioactive spider's gift. Venom was waiting when Peter arrived, which established immediately that the meeting had been arranged, that Peter had been guided here through a sequence of information and suggestion that the merged entity had orchestrated. It stood at the rooftop's edge against the city's nighttime sky, larger than a person should be and darker than the darkness around it, the white spider emblem on its chest the only element of its appearance that made reference to the heroic iconography it was inverting, the symbol of Spider-Man's identity worn on the body of the entity that had decided to dedicate itself to Spider-Man's undoing. Peter landed several yards away and felt the particular quality of confronting something that knew him completely. There is a specific discomfort in being known by an enemy that is different from and worse than the discomfort of being known by a friend. because the knowledge that a friend holds of you is organised by their care for your well-being is used in service of your interests and your flourishing, while the knowledge that an enemy holds is organised by the inverse of care is used in service of the precise targeting of the places where you are most exposed. When a friend knows where you are vulnerable, the knowledge is a form of trust. When an enemy knows where you are vulnerable, the knowledge is a form of weapon, and facing the weapon is the experience of having every private thing about yourself turned outward and aimed back at you. Venom spoke first, and what it said in those first exchanges established the rhetorical mode that would characterize its engagement with Peter throughout this period, a mode that combined the direct articulation of grievance with the deployment of intimate knowledge in ways designed to produce the specific psychological effect of exposure, the feeling of being seen without consent in the places you have worked hardest to protect. It named the people Peter loved, not as threats, not as declarations of intent to harm, but simply as demonstrations that it knew them, that it could name them, and place them in the domestic geography it had mapped, that the private world Peter had built behind his mask was not private from Venom in any meaningful sense. The physical battle that followed moved through the rooftop and down the building's exterior and through the streets below with a quality that Peter found different from his experience of fighting other powerful enemies, different in ways that took him time to identify precisely because the difference was primarily experiential rather than tactical. He was stronger than most of his enemies and faster and more agile, and these advantages applied in his engagements with Venom as they applied elsewhere, the speed and the acrobatic unpredictability of his movement making him difficult to catch and hold, the agility allowing him to create and exploit the angles that Venom's greater mass made inaccessible to the merged entity. But the fighting felt different, felt like something he was doing in a medium that was denser than usual, because the knowledge that Venom carried about him was present in every exchange as a quality of the opponent's anticipation, a slight but consistent edge in the merged entity's ability to read his intentions that went beyond what any opponent had previously demonstrated. Venom knew things about how Peter moved that Peter had never articulated. It knew the tendencies that had settled into his fighting style over years of practice, the angles he preferred and the angles he avoided, the moments when his commitment to protecting bystanders would override his tactical judgment, and the moments when the opposite prioritization was more likely. It knew these things because it had spent weeks inside his nervous system, had felt his body make choices before his conscious mind endorsed them, had learned the grammar of his physical decision-making from the level at which the decisions were made rather than from the level at which they were expressed. Fighting Peter Parker was, for Venom, something closer to fighting oneself than fighting a stranger, and the uncanny advantage this produced was not decisive, but it was persistent. A constant slight pressure in Venom's favour that could not be addressed by any tactical adjustment, because the information that generated the advantage was already inside Venom and could not be removed. Peter's tactical response to the first confrontation was effective in the limited sense of producing an outcome in which he was able to disengage and withdraw without serious injury, which in the context of an opponent he could not sense approaching, and who knew his fighting style from the inside was a more meaningful achievement than it might have appeared. He used the city's architecture with the fluency that years of navigating it had produced, finding paths through the geometry of the urban environment that created distance and complexity in ways that Venom's greater mass made difficult to follow, and he used the sonic vulnerability that Reed Richards had identified during the laboratory analysis, seeking out environments where ambient noise concentrated and using it as a tool for disruption, which produced genuine effects on Venom's coherence and bought him the margins he needed to move beyond immediate threat. But disengaging was not the same as resolving, and the confrontation left him with more questions than it had answered, a clearer picture of what he was facing and a less clear picture of what he could do about it. The sonic vulnerability was real and exploitable, but not decisive, requiring conditions that were not always available, and an exposure that Venom, once it understood that the vulnerability was known, would become more careful to avoid. The spider-sense silence was permanent and not addressable through any adjustment he could make to his own capabilities. The intimate knowledge Venom carried was indelible and not diminishable by any amount of counter-strategy, because the knowledge had been formed in a context that no longer existed and could not be revised from the outside. What Peter found himself returning to, in the days between the direct confrontations, was the observation he had made early in his analysis of Venom's psychology, that the hatred was organized and sustained and required him to remain central to the merged entity's identity. He thought about this with the careful, methodical attention that was his most essential quality, turning it over and examining it from different angles, looking for the place where it became something he could work with, rather than simply something he had to endure. The hatred needed him present, needed him engaged, needed him functioning as the organizing target of the merged entity's purpose. This meant that there was a relationship between Spider-Man and Venom that was not simply adversarial in the clean sense of two opposed forces, but that had the more complicated quality of a relationship that each party was sustaining through its choices, that could be altered by altering those choices, that was not as fixed and permanent as Venom's intensity made it feel. He thought about Eddie Brock, specifically and separately from the merged entity, trying to hold the image of the man beneath the symbiote clearly enough to see where the man's genuine grievances ended, and the symbiote's amplification of those grievances began. The journalism, the false identification, the lost career, and the lost marriage, and the lost sense of professional identity that had been the thing between Eddie and the emptiness. These were real losses, and the wrong that had precipitated them, however indirectly Peter had participated in it, was real as a wrong. The man in the church before the symbiote found him had been a person at the end of his available options, carrying a hatred that was comprehensible in human terms, organized around a genuine injustice even if the organization had become disproportionate to the original cause. The symbiote had found that person and made the disproportionality structural, had given the hatred a body and a voice and physical capabilities that transformed it from the psychological condition of a broken man into the organizing purpose of a merged entity, with powers that made it genuinely dangerous. But the man was still there, inside the we, and the man's wounds, however amplified, were still the wounds of a person who had wanted to matter and had been told, by a sequence of events whose final element bore Spider-Man's face, that he did not. Peter understood that wound from a different angle than Eddie did. Having spent his own life navigating the gap between wanting to matter and the complex costs that mattering in the way he had chosen to matter consistently imposed, the understanding did not dissolve the threat, but it complicated the threat in ways that Peter suspected would eventually be significant. Mary Jane watched him move through these days of analysis and confrontation, and the particular exhaustion that comes from fighting an enemy who knows you better than most of your friends do, and she offered him what she had always been best at offering, which was presence without demand, the company of someone who loved him specifically and was not asking him to be different from what he was, or to resolve the situation faster than it was possible to resolve it. She slept less easily than she had before Venom's visit to the apartment. She did not tell Peter this, because she understood that his capacity for guilt about the costs his life imposed on her was already operating near its limit, and that adding to it would not help either of them. She carried her own unease with the characteristic grace of a person who has decided that the life she has chosen is worth its costs, and intends to continue choosing it with her eyes open to what choosing it requires. The city moved around all of this with its immense and impartial continuity, the streets filling and emptying on their daily rhythms, the lights of buildings going on and off in patterns that mapped the private lives of millions of people who did not know that somewhere in the darkness above their neighborhoods, two entities that had been made from the same materials, the same alien organism and the same human city, and the same fundamental question of what a person does with power when power is what they have, were working out the terms of a relationship that neither of them had chosen, and neither of them, not yet, knew how to end. And so the story rests here, in the quiet that follows long tellings, in the particular stillness that arrives when the last word has been spoken, and the shapes of things are allowed to settle into their true proportions. Two broken things finding each other in the dark, a hero learning what his shadow was made of, a symbiote crossing the distance between stars in search of somewhere to belong. These are not small themes dressed in dark costumes and given names. They are the oldest human questions, wearing the clothes that each new generation finds for them. What Venom reflects in the end is what all shadows reflect, the shape of the light that casts them. Let that thought go gently now. Let the city sounds fade and the darkness become simply darkness, comfortable and without threat. The ordinary dark of a room where you are safe and warm, and held by nothing more complicated than the simple fact of rest. You have travelled far tonight. Let the web go slack. Let the buildings fall away beneath you. Let the voice of the story become the sound of your own breathing, slow and even, carrying you now without effort toward the place where all stories pause, and the only thing left is the quiet, and the quiet is enough, and you are, in this moment, exactly where you're meant to be.